when I wrote the book, I kind of did my own searches and talked to some connections that I had within the CIA, and just to verify exactly what the how this technology works. They wouldn't go as far as admitting putting voices in the heads. They had no problem admitting the directed energy capability,
Mm,
and um, and started looking around. And prior to my book, there was a couple of books where people had mentioned it in passing, but nobody with really any credentials. So when I wrote the book, I figured half the people that read this are going to think I'm just as crazy as the victims. But if it reaches a few people and convinces them that this is otherwise, then I figure it's done its job, and it seems to have done that. I've got a second book that's in editing right now called Guinea Pigs, Technologies of Control, which kind of goes more into the history of how it became, and kind of at least what I see is probably going to be the only way out of it. So
uh-huh.
because everybody's looking for ways to shield themselves and things like that, and the bottom line is we're going to need socio-political change probably to do anything about it.
Definitely, I can see where that would be the case. Well, I have a copy of your book here, and I've read it, and I found it fascinating, especially. Well, I mean, I thought the background into the technology was really good. It was pretty thorough, and it really opened my eyes to the capabilities that are available out there. But what just blew my mind was just your personal narrative in here and what you went through. I love to touch on some of this stuff, you know, during the interview as well. So feel free to reference that if you like.
Okay.
I just, it just boggled my mind how that was possible, and the things that they did, and the monotony to it, and how it just happened over such a prolonged period of time. Um,
Well, and that's what kind of, I have a pretty good connection with SAPD here.
uh-huh.
So when I went to the sex crimes department, the lieutenant in charge had been a patient of mine and was a friend of my father's who was retired SAPD. And he told me straight out. He said, if I heard this story from anybody else, I'd think they're crazy. But you had my life in your hands, asleep on the table for surgery. I do anesthesia.
Right.
And he said, but coming from you, and your story's never changed. And so they went through ICE and tried to see if any of this video, if they were videoing any of the sexual assaults and putting them anywhere. And basically, in the end, they basically it's almost kind of like this former FBI guy is allowed to do it,
Uh-huh.
sort of, which is like what I kind of wondered all along. Is if I went following people around and tampering with their cars and standing around their front doors, I'd be arrested pretty quickly. And these guys were so brazen. This wasn't surveillance from afar, or I kind of think that car's following me, or I kind of think that person's following me. These were people literally standing in front of our windows right until you would come walking down the sidewalk, and they would run and jump in a car, or three cars following me, moving, jockeying around at 2 in the morning on a weekday,
Uh-huh.
coming home from her house and shooting the finger at me when they would drive by, or trying to block me in until I'd finally maneuver my way around. And the only good thing about being in Texas is what ended the stalking was when the sheriff came out to my house and said, you know what, you live in a rural area. If it's nighttime and they're on your property, shoot them. And there was not anything that was questionable about what was going on.
Yeah.
So
Well, good for you for defending yourself, and I mean, obviously, it sounded like you had to based on what you experienced. I mean, that was just horrendous. I couldn't believe the levels that they went to. But let's dive into some of that. But
okay.
first, maybe we'll just start with some of these questions that I have laid out here. Paul and I put these together, so that's where they come from. So it's kind of an overview, but basically, why don't you just start by explaining what the problem is as you see it, and the ways in which classified technologies are being used on targeted persons. Kind of a general introduction to
Well,
that.
from my experience, it seems to be a form of remote neural monitoring is one of the terms we use for it. The other term is psychotronic weaponry that has been designed to interact with the human nervous system in order to remotely pick up on someone's neural network or EEG, and not only receive that and monitor it, but manipulate it and place it back into the victim to control their emotions or control their actions or bodily functions for that matter. The other more recent term we have for that is EEG heterodyning or EEG cloning. The difference between EEG heterodyning and EEG cloning would be, let's say, me remotely receiving your EEG and then duplicating it and putting that in another person to give them your same thoughts or feelings or physical reactions. EEG heterodyning would be receiving your EEG, manipulating it to put it back inside your head to give us a desired physical reaction or emotional reaction.
And exactly, I mean, give me an idea of how this technology works. I mean,
I wish I could give you a good example of how it works. I know Robert Duncan worked on some of the projects. I mean, he claims it's a very complex, mathematical situation that does it. The bottom line, though, at least from what I've been told, is that it's mostly based on Robert Malick's patent of remote neural monitoring, in which he found that if you shoot two dissimilar frequencies into the human brain, that the human brain will actually create an interference frequency as it tries to duplicate the two dissimilar frequencies, and the interference frequency that gets transmitted back out of your brain can be decoded and your EEG digitally manipulated out of that. Now, and that patent came out in like 1974. It was Malech, Robert Malick. And it was actually invented as a way to monitor pilots. That way, if you had a pilot that was falling asleep or a pilot that was starting to hallucinate, they could see that remotely and then stimulate the pilot to wake him up or to bring him out of a delusion, especially fighter pilots that are on, continuously long missions. It appears to be mostly being done in that way. Now, one of the more scary things that's come to light lately is the way the NSA is monitoring our computer systems. And they're doing that with continuous wave radar, or CWR. Lately, there's been a program of interdiction where the computers and smartphones and things are actually gotten before they actually reach our shores for sale, and are being implanted with a particular type of implant. One of them is called a cottonmouth, at least for PCs, and that's a small chip that actually goes into the cord between the computer and the monitor. And when that chip is hit with continuous wave radar, it will begin to transmit up to 8 kilometers away whatever data is being sent from your computer to your screen. It may be monitored in real time, or it may just be data that's collected, automatically without anybody actually watching it. But one of the thoughts that we have is that it might be continuous wave radar being used on humans as well. And if you see Jacob Applebaum, some of his speeches and reports and exposure on this, he kind of alludes to some of Snowden's releases, that the same technology that they're using on computers, they may be actually using on human systems as well.
so Snowden leaked a lot of this information about the gathering of information and sensitive private information of individuals through cell phones and computers and even your search engines and anything that you do on social media networks. But what you're talking about is like EEG monitoring that is able to translate the brain patterns into verbal language, like English, and then put it back in your brain. Is that right? Or
Yeah, essentially, yeah, and that is by definition what EEG heterodyning is. Like I said, it would be taking your basic EEG, receiving it, manipulating it, and spitting it back to you. And one thing that we found a long time ago within a lot of the neurologic studies is if you bombard the brain long enough with a certain frequency, the brain receives that frequency and adapts to that frequency and begins to operate in that frequency. And specifically with Malick's patent, if you're using two dissimilar frequencies and you get one hemisphere of the brain operating at one frequency, the other hemisphere at a different frequency, they create an interference frequency. And we know the brain transmits. That's why we can actually look at an EEG. Now, traditionally in medicine, we're using it with leads on the scalp, and that was the whole point of his patent, is that you no longer actually had to have leads on the scalp, that it could be done remotely with radio frequency.
Wow.
Now, that's not in sum the total of what these victims are experiencing. That's the monitoring and maybe some of the emotion manipulation. Um, Also, you can control the brain into making the body twitch or making the body do just about anything, since everything's controlled by the brain. But there also seems to be a directed energy component to the victimization of these people, because most of them are also complaining, of eye burning, skin burning, and what would appear to be microwave energy based weapons, body heating. Most of those techniques used for sleep deprivation. Almost all of the victims that I've spoken to complain that the attacks seem to be worse at night and seem to be geared at actually sleep depriving them.
Tell me more about how that technology works, though. I mean,
Well, the directed
like, yeah.
directed energy weapons have been worked on for some time, and if you look at the addendum, the Army's addendum to the technology of non-lethal weaponry that came out late '80s, they clearly talk about using direct microwave energy as a weapon. We're already seeing that in the active denial system, millimeter wave system, Silent Guardian, which is a joystick controlled millimeter wave weapon that is actually being used experimentally in at least one Los Angeles prison. That way, when prisoners get out of line, a guard can actually manipulate the beam and burn the person until they get out of the way of the beam. So that's been worked on, for some time now. How it's being delivered, possibly via satellite or being, delivered long range, is classified technology that, hopefully will eventually get somebody that's a whistleblower to tell us more about how that's done. From what I've been told by some of my contacts, that a lot of this is being done, especially the weaponry, by satellite. There's been other, world leaders, that have complained about hearing voices and being attacked with directed energy. Of course, most of these victims that complain about it are immediately sent to a psychiatrist,
Right.
who won't Google anything or won't look at any of their research. But the directed energy component has been around for quite a while. How it's being used on such a grand scale is yet to be seen.
But it's been demonstrated that it can be used in short range, like over, kind of a network or within proximity to someone, using, whatever the techniques are or whatever the tools are, but it can be delivered like someone next door to you or outside in a car.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, they've already, well, like I've said, you've seen the active denial system. Now it does, that's basically mounted on a Humvee. As far as what I've seen, a lot of victims complaining about possible handheld directed energy weapons that are being used on them by possibly by a neighbor or someone from a car. I think most of what we're dealing with in the victim population is probably satellite based, or something much more remote than that. I know in my personal studies, I've actually taken victims onto a ranch here in Texas where there's no power lines, there's no cell towers. You can do RF scans on the property and see that it's pretty clear. And these victims still hear voices; they still get attacked. I've done the same thing by taking victims in a boat into the Gulf of Mexico to escape the possibility of it being handheld weapons or neighbors. They still hear voices; they still get attacked. And some of the victims that I've talked to, they're probably a little better explaining their situation. Have even got on planes and flown to other countries. I had one victim who's pretty well off financially, that actually flew to Cuba to try to get away from this, and was still hearing voices and still being attacked even in Cuba. And just so you know, these are all people that were professionals, were educated, were functioning in society just fine. And most of them were between 30 and 40 when they first started getting victimized. Much older than you would typically see somebody all of a sudden come down with schizophrenia. and no reason to have all of a sudden developed an acute delusional disorder. And I know in some of the questions I've been asked before is how do you determine whether this is mental illness or this is somebody being victimized? And probably the two biggest discriminators that I've seen to determine that are most of the victims are educated, most of them were functioning, most of them are professionals. I've talked to a lot of doctors, a lot of lawyers, whistleblowers from the National Geospatial Agency, a couple of whistleblowers I've worked with from the NSA. These were functioning people, and they can tell you the day they started hearing voices and started experiencing attack. And typically it's in the 40s, late 30s, early 40s, with no history of mental illness and high functioning in society prior to that day. The other big discriminator is with true mental illness, even bad schizophrenia, medication works. And being a physician, I certainly don't want to come off as saying that everybody that hears voices is being victimized by technology. There's mental illness. Schizophrenia exists. Schizophrenia usually responds to medication. And in some of these victims that have been forced either by a licensure board or by their occupations, in a job setting to seek psychiatric help, many of them are placed on medications meant for schizophrenia or for delusional disorder, and so they're stuck on these medications, and they're still being attacked, and they're still hearing voices. The symptoms won't subside with traditional psychiatric treatment.
It's fascinating. Yeah, I know from my research that schizophrenia doesn't it typically set in around late teens, early 20s.
Yeah, in a male, even younger than that sometimes. In a female, it can be a little bit older, into the mid 20s. And the bottom line, and even most psychiatrists would agree with me, that true schizophrenic people are kind of those people that were never right. I mean, they were weird kids. They grew up into weird adults. But typically schizophrenia does respond to medication. It's the problem is once they're better on their medication, is they feel like they don't need their medication and they come off of it, then they go back into acute schizophrenia. But with these victims, a lot of them are being, mandated into psychiatric treatment, and they're taking medications that are geared for delusional disorder or schizophrenia or paranoid schizophrenia, and they're still being attacked, and they're still hearing voices. One good case in point was another physician here in Texas, was a cardiologist that came to me for help, and he unfortunately went to the Texas Medical Board and told them, I think I'm being victimized because I'm a physician. Have you guys ever heard of this before? They immediately called him in, suspended his license, put him through a month psychiatric stay. With some legal help and several hearings, he got his license back, but is mandated to be on psychiatric medication. And talking to him after all this happened, he still has people parking in his driveway, shining bright lights through his house. He's still hearing voices, and he's still being attacked with what he perceives to be directed energy, despite treatment. So that's a pretty big discriminator. And this is a man who was in his 40s, who had the intelligence and the psychiatric stability to get through 4 years of undergrad, 4 years of medical school, and 6 years of cardiology residency. To all of a sudden at 45 or 46 become schizophrenic, at least in my mind, is an impossibility.
Well, I want to talk more about the victims and what kind of people they are and why they might be being targeted. But let's talk a little bit more about some of the techniques that they use. Let's talk about some of the gang stalking that you mentioned and that you yourself experienced in your book. Can you tell me a little bit more about that?
Sure. The kind of the old term, or the term that was used online the most, was gang stalking. I think in my book I even refer to it more as organized stalking, mainly because the term gang stalking, people kind of envision, kids in matching leather jackets or something out of the Warriors movie, which is not what this is. It's truly organized stalking. These are where you'll notice people unknown to you. These aren't people hired by a loved one or anything traditionally, or not an ex-boyfriend or ex-girlfriend, but all of a sudden you notice, the same vehicles following you everywhere you go. people standing around your front door, standing around work, creating scenes in grocery stores around you where, they may be talking to someone else, within earshot of you, but talking about something you did or something you said to a loved one. And it's geared to let you know that there are people that know your lifestyle and know the specifics of your lifestyle. I think the organized stalking is done for two reasons. For one, it's a psychological warfare. It puts the person in a victim mindset. It also puts that victim down the pathway to a mandated psychiatric stay, because when they go around telling everybody that I'm being followed 24/7 by these people, and sometimes they'll tell neighbors or tell loved ones that they're FBI when they're not. So the victim starts telling everybody that they're under some type of federal investigation or federal surveillance, when usually I think this is probably being done by private investigators. However, it's private investigators, usually with former CIA or former FBI experience, and which is why they're being allowed to access the technology. At least in the case here in San Antonio, it was the PI group that we identified here. It was a former FBI fraud investigator that opened up his own private investigative agency after he retired. He hired nothing but his family members and pretty much advertises corporate espionage, and is the guy you turn to if you want to harass an ex-wife during a divorce proceeding to make her look crazy, possibly to get out of paying child support or get custody of your kids or to get out of paying alimony. The other than getting you down that pathway to a psychiatrist and putting in you a victim mind state, I think the other function of the organized stalking is to GPS you by vicinity. Most of these victims think they're chipped because they seem to be able to be tracked everywhere they go. And we have found a handful of chips in people, but by and large, after looking at thousands of MRIs, and not only me doing some RF scans looking for chips, but ISA Act, which is an organization I'm affiliated with, has actually gone around the country actually scanning a lot of victims, doing radio frequency scanning. And while we will find radio transmissions either emanating into or from the victim, when you image those sites, we're not typically finding chips. Which leads me to believe that most of this is probably being done without any type of an implant. Well, the way you would do that, in my mind, would be to stalk that person and GPS them by vicinity until you can use whatever technology that is being used to remotely track them, by their EEG. And there's other ways to remotely track someone by body imaging, by facial recognition. I've heard some of the people talk about now DNA resonance, which using continuous wave radar, if you bombard the human body with it, we all have a different DNA signature, and that can actually resonate and be received. So I think the organized stalking serves two purposes: victim mindset, as well as GPSing by vicinity.
And a lot of this stuff actually happened to you personally. I mean, in your book, you even mentioned some pretty unbelievable things that were happening regarding surveillance techniques, the taking of doors off of their hinges and taken apart with elaborate cameras, small hidden cameras being inserted into them. Tell me more
Yeah,
about that.
sure. In the book, I actually that particular incident was a girl that was doing some typing for me and holding on to some documents for me after I found out that my home was being broken into fairly consistently. I live in a rural area with no homes around me, so my house was pretty fair game for breaking and entering, and actually had sheriff reports of at least 16 times they came out with my alarm going off due to the inside motion detector being activated. They weren't kicking in the door, they were remotely opening my garage door coming through an attic access. So the alarm wasn't going off until they actually set off the motion detectors. So when the police would get to my house, there was no bashed in door or broken window. So they would leave a note on the door saying that we looked at the perimeter and there appeared to be no breaking and entering. So, get your alarm checked. When the whole time they were coming, there were people inside my home. The girl that was actually storing much of my data and helping me do some of the typing of the book noticed that her doors were getting torn up. Her interior doors were being torn up. And then one day, after slamming one of her doors, heard something knock inside the door. And these are the hollow type doors that have a cardboard honeycomb system in between two veneer panels. So we opened up one of the doors to find that there was a 9-volt battery attached to essentially a low end nanny cam that had been mounted to the top of a plastic piece glued to the inside of the door with a small pinhole drilled into the door where it could actually shoot from the door into the bedroom, and then another one shooting from a door into the living room where she did most of the typing. Those also would pick up audio. Now that's real low end technology, and that would require a car nearby to do, or a neighbor nearby to do the reception. And in her case, just about every night around 9 or 10 o'clock, a car would roll up in front of her house and park on the curb with someone inside it that would sit there all night. And that's one of the other problems with organized stalking. As long as they don't come on your property, you can actually sit in a vehicle on the street, on the curb, however long you want. That's not illegal, and the police can't help you with that.
Wow. So let's talk about the targeted individuals. Why them? Why you, for example?
Well, in my case in the book, the girl that I was engaged to had kind of attracted the fancy of an older ear, nose, and throat surgeon in San Antonio, who had told me several years ago that he had this former FBI guy that he referred to as the ghost that did this barely legal harassment. And his exact words, he said, "I'm hiding him from my wife in case I ever need to use him to make her look crazy during a divorce." Well, at the time he told me that, I kind of blew it off and, thought, well, maybe this is just a guy that's just making himself look, grandiose and probably a little bigger than life. Until 2 years later, when I was engaged to this girl who I knew he had found attractive, and we had been on vacation with this guy and his wife before. This was a man and his wife who were well known to me. And then when I noticed her being stalked, and like I said, I live in a rural area. At the time, it wasn't even a driveway; it was a gravel road through a ranch to my home. And I would see her car leave the driveway at 2 a.m., and then immediately two more cars turn their lights on and follow her 5 miles up a gravel road to the nearest highway. I started following those vehicles, writing down the plate numbers. They all came back to this PI agency that he had told me about several years prior that he used to harass competitors, corporate espionage type of stuff. So she was strictly targeted just basically by someone interested in sexually assaulting her, which was what wound up happening with her. Now, most of the other victims I've talked to, there almost seems no reason for their victimization. I have had a handful of whistleblowers from government agencies that have came to me that are being targeted for being whistleblowers. But by and large, most of the victims seem to be randomly selected. And at least from a medical standpoint, being a physician and a researcher, this looks to me to be experimentation. It's being done in every major city. It's being done methodically, like it's being done with a manual, an instruction manual. Most of these victims will kind of report the same scenarios that they're hearing in their heads, report the same scenarios with the organized stalking, and the same scenarios with the directed energy attack. So in my mind, on a grand scale, it's probably experimentation or continuation of MK Ultra. Uh, Having had their hands slapped initially by the Rockefeller Commission and the Church Committee hearings, I think what they did was be a little more careful to farm this out to governmental or prior governmentally hired people who are now in private industry. So there's some plausible deniability when and if these people ever get caught. So, they farmed out the technology to PI groups that are, most of them probably owned by former FBI or former CIA people who are now operating as civilians but being given access to government technology. It would appear to me that they're able to carte blanche select the victims however they want to, as long as the data goes back to the appropriate agencies at the top.
So it seems like what the stuff that Snowden leaked out was really just the tip of the iceberg compared to this really high tech surveillance that's going on that we know nothing about.
Yeah, I think it was the tip of the iceberg, and he has a lot more documents to release.
Right.
So I'm wondering if some of this is eventually going to come around. Russell Tice had alluded to some of this when he was a whistleblower from the NSA. He had initially mentioned that it wasn't just phone calls going overseas that they were listening to, that they were listening to, pillow talk between, married men and their girlfriends, and basically kind of gave the scenario that they knew specific times that they could tune into specific phone calls and basically listen to, married guys and their girlfriends as entertainment. And it's come full circle to where even the NSA admitted that they've caught a number of their agents using this technology and what they kind of kiddingly refer to as love-int. Instead of human intelligence, human signals intelligence, SIGINT, love-int, where NSA agents are using this technology to spy on ex-wives or run the plate numbers and spy on girls that they possibly met or seen at a grocery store. And if you look at the way the victims spread out demographically, and there's been studies on this, Freedom from Covert Surveillance and Harassment, has ongoing studies, checking the data of demographically who's being victimized. 70% or so of the victims are female. And most of these people are not radicals. They're not politically inclined. They're educated people that were functioning in normal jobs and having normal lives until one day they started hearing voices and being attacked and being stalked. And it seems to be intentionally a random sample.
Well, I was just going to ask. I mean, how many of these people are dissidents or writers or whistleblowers themselves are involved in, some know something about government policy or are involved in changing policy? Are any of them really?
No, not many. That's a definitely the rare. Now, like I said, I've had a handful of people that fit that description. Most of the people are housewives, doctors, lawyers. I mean, trust me, I certainly didn't want to be, the spearhead of this movement. I'm a medical doctor, was engaged to a girl who was a mortgage broker. Our plan was to be married and start a family and just live out the rest of our lives normally. It was never planned in my life to have this book or my next book come out or deal with any of this, and certainly not be the spearhead against any of it.
Well, let's talk about who's responsible. Who do you think is responsible for this? And you talked a little bit about the experimentation factor, but is there any other rhyme or reason to why they're doing this?
Well, I mean, if you look historically at the way MK Ultra started, they've been looking for a long time how to remotely control human beings. With MK Ultra and the technology that existed at the time, you were kind of stuck with using, psychoactive drugs. A lot of people were subjected to 900 or 1,000 times electroconvulsive therapy to try to wipe the slate of the brain clean and create Manchurian candidates. Those were multiple sub-projects. The design of that study was, I hate to say beautiful, but was so well done. I mean, they studied every facet of human behavior in MK Ultra. Not all of the sub projects were LSD and brain chipping. You've heard of some of the worst ones that dealt with that, but some of these other sub projects were watching kids on playgrounds to study, childhood human interaction. Watching, adult men that use prostitutes to determine sexual interaction. They studied every facet of human behavior, and then also the ones that you heard about that were giving psychoactive drugs, or Ewan Cameron up at McGill University, using a combination of electroshock therapy and convulsive drugs or brain chipping. So it actually started in the late 50s, early 60s with MK Ultra. Now, once they got their hand slapped at the Rockefeller Commission, you know, a lot of information came out in Freedom of Information, and there's been some really good books written on MK Ultra based on what the government released in Freedom of Information. Well, most of these sub projects, found success. The research didn't stop. The freedom flow of freedom of information certainly stopped, but the research continued under different names, under different operation names, and certainly with them being a lot more careful as far as how anyone would actually pick up on the fact that it's experimentation. So, at least in my mind, when you have, estimated 300,000 people voicing identical complaints of hearing voices, voice to skull, directed energy weapons attack, and what would appear to be a random sample, it's got to be experimentation. And the only place I can see that going is figuring out, long-term study, because most of these victims have been victimized for 10 years or more. From a medical perspective with this technology, you would want to know how quickly you can degrade someone's psychiatric status, how quickly you can degrade someone's lifestyle to control them. And more than that, you would want to know, are there any weird cancers or any weird illnesses that are going to be caused by chronic bombardment with extremely low frequency waves, or any other radio frequency waves or continuous radar. That's going to be real important to know if this technology is being developed eventually to control the masses. You have to make sure that there's not going to be any weird cancers, thyroid cancers, leukemias, brain tumors, or anything that are going to arise from it. And that's the only reason I can see that some of these victims have been victimized for over a decade, because their lives are destroyed usually within a year of being having this technology used on them. So why continuously experiment on them would only be to find out medical data from chronic exposure.
So, what is their end game? Who benefits, and what's their purpose for doing this? Do you think?
Well, I mean, I think the purpose, as I said, if you look back historically, they've been looking for a way to control the masses. And when the technology got to the point where directed energy could be used remotely, with weaponry that actually can manipulate the human nervous system, I think the end game is mass population control. In an interview probably about a year ago, Vladimir Putin actually admitted that Russia has been working on psychotronic weapons for quite some time. None of our media picked up on that. The only person that at least contacted me to make a comment against what he said was El Spectador, which is a newspaper, a news agency out of South America. But Putin said that whichever country controlled the best psychotronic weapons would control the globe without bullets or missiles. You control the decision making, you don't need bullets or missiles.
So, what can we do to protect ourselves? How can we? Are there tools to monitor, for example, microwave frequencies that are being emitted in a certain area or on an individual? And how do we protect? How can one protect themselves against?
Well, most of the victims that I've talked to are looking for shielding methods. It would appear that most of this is being done with extremely low frequency waves, which are not easily shielded. You can shield those in a very well-made anechoic chamber. With ISA Act, we actually took people to Belgium and had access to a scientific research anechoic chamber. And those people did find some relief in the chamber, and we did notice some attenuation of the signals that were either coming off of them or going into them while in the chamber. And these people were victims that were studied next to controls that we monitored. And the controls, who had never experienced any type of electronic harassment, showed up negative. The victims actually still showed up positive. It did seem to be attenuated in a very well-made research anechoic chamber. Unfortunately, that's beyond the affordability of most of these victims. So shielding, I don't think, is going to be the way to go with that. What we need is education of the public. Once most of the public understands that this type of weaponry exists, it would be hard to degrade someone's life because they're going to know not to run to people telling people that they're under a federal investigation or under federal surveillance. Hopefully, avoid any psychiatric diagnoses which secondarily victimize the victim. As far as an end game to this, education, public exposure, awareness, and socio-political change. Unfortunately, we've come to a point in government where we have government that's grown too large. It's no longer, as people used to say, the government's supposed to fear the people. It's the other way around now. The people fear the government. We have a government that's out of control. And it's going to take people at least going to the polls and using their election choices to get people back in government with some ethics and some morals. Um, I think most of the Congress people know this exists. Most of these victims immediately send letters to their respective congresswomen and congressmen. Most of them return back with letters saying that they've never heard this or they don't think it's going on, or even at worst, getting letters returned to them recommending they see a psychiatrist. Dennis Kucinich mentioned this type of technology in a legislation he wrote for non-weaponization of space. Before the actual bill made it to Congress, all of the writing and references to psychotronic weapons, which were in the initial bill, were taken out. Even with that taken out, the bill didn't pass. Congress wouldn't pass the bill to not weaponize space. The other big thing in this country is we don't have legislation against experimentation by the government. We have a legislation called the Common Rule that's supposed to protect citizens from governmental experimentation. However, there's so many loopholes in the Common Rule that it's very easy for black budgeted intelligence agencies to have this type of experimentation with no known institutional review board and nobody overseeing the research. John Glenn, when he was a senator, tried to pass a bill making informed consent an absolute requirement for any federally funded research or experimentation, and Congress shot it down. They wouldn't pass it. You may remember a couple of years back, they had the Bioethics Commission's hearing. I spoke at one of those hearings. When the press released the fact that the Guatemalans had been experimented on, similar to the Tuskegee experiment with gonorrhea and syphilis, weaponized forms of gonorrhea and syphilis, it wasn't until that had media exposure that Obama appointed the Bioethics Commission. And their job was to find out if any non-consensual experimentation funded by the government was still ongoing in our country or abroad. There were 4 meetings. At each one of those meetings, there were well over 100 people in the public forum. Almost all of the people in the public forum were complaining of electronic harassment, directed energy attack, and hearing voices. Unfortunately, the people he appointed to the actual board to hear it were mostly apologist bioethicists from Harvard and Yale. I was the only person that actually got up there and pointed out the loopholes in the Common Rule that allows for non-consensual experimentation. And some of the writing in that legislation is such that it essentially says that it's okay to perform the experimentation as long as the experimentees are notified after the fact. And typically that's what you've seen done with our government. We did it with radiation experiments. When we flew radioactive clouds of iodine over major cities to see how quickly people would get thyroid cancer. As people came in reporting sickness, they were told they were crazy. Well, then when Clinton got to office, we had the Acre hearings. And he made all of these agencies put forward their data, and lo and behold, these people weren't crazy. They were getting leukemia, they were getting thyroid cancer, and they were getting radiation sickness. And that came to light. Same thing with the Tuskegee experiment, the syphilis study. These men were infected intentionally with syphilis, denied treatment for a lifetime, passed on that infection to their wives, their girlfriends, and their children, who passed on syphilis to their children. And it wasn't until there was some media exposure 40 years into the experiment that this was done. Well, then the surviving members and surviving family members got a lame apology from the government. That's typically what our government has always done. Do the experimentation. Once the media brings it to light, give the survivors an apology. And that's one of the things that we're hoping to avoid with electronic harassment and this experimentation is bring it to an end while the victims are actually still around to show up at a hearing.
Well, I think that covers pretty much everything that I wanted to discuss. We kind of went in a little bit of a circle there, but I think we covered all the data. And is there anything else that you wanna say in wrapping up, or?
No, not that I can think of. I mean, there is so much stuff coming out. I mean, even the book that I have in editing right now that will hopefully be released here in another month or two. No sooner did I get it electronically sent off to my publisher when all of a sudden, here's three more news stories that come out about some more graphic stuff from the NSA. Um, Now, one thing I will say, while MK Ultra was mostly a CIA program, I think probably a lot of this being done today is probably NSA based. The NSA does seem to be focusing more of their attention on some of these more exotic weapons. So,
And how many terrorists have they actually caught as a result of this?
oh yeah, you're the with all the surveillance that's going on, they seem to be surveilling us mostly. None of this surveillance seems to be curtailing terrorism. And I actually mentioned that in my next book, Guinea Pigs. That while they're passing most of this off as a national security issue, um, we're not catching any terrorists. The Middle East is on fire. It's almost all of those countries are back under radical hands. They all hate us, and it's your chances of dying in a car crash going to work is 1 in 30. Your chances of dying from a terrorist bomb is damn near 1 in 1 million. So
Yeah, what are you really going to be worried about?
yeah, yeah. I mean, it's easy to scare the public with terrorism, and terrorist bombs, but
Media
we're
does a
giving
great job of that.
yeah, but we're giving away our civil rights. We're giving away our privacy to protect ourselves from a boogeyman that I think is just really non-existent.
And now it seems to be the increase in gun violence is another direction to take away more of our civil liberties and our freedoms.
Well, and some of the gun violence that we're seeing, if you look at the Aaron Alexis thing, the Aaron Alexis went and shot up the Navy Yard. He had emailed Freedom from Surveillance and Harassment several times, asking for help and
Hearing
complaining about
voices,
and complaining about the sleep deprivation
right?
mostly. And he worked in the IT sector. He was familiar with this weaponry. He knew it was extremely low frequency wave weaponry, which is why he etched that on the side of the shotgun. My personal belief with Aaron Alexis is I think they intended him to shoot up the airport in Norfolk, where he initially had an outbreak. He was walking by some people that he thought were making obscene gestures and obscene comments to him, and he went off on those people, and he was detained and arrested there temporarily for acting out in the airport. Well, then he came to the realization that those people weren't actually saying anything to him, that what he was hearing in his head that was being transmitted to him. If you look at that scenario, it wasn't not long after that we did have an airport shooting in LA
That's right.
that again was someone that was hearing voices and had actually voiced complaints of suspected mind control. When he went and shot up the Navy Yard, I don't think that was their intent. I think their intent was for him to go get a little bit more violent in the airport. Due to the fact that he etched "This is my elf wave weapon" on the side of his shotgun, I think the shooting at the Navy Yard is where he perceived the research was being done on some of this weaponry and was actually a vengeance shooting, not him being controlled to be a controlled assassin at the Navy Yard.
Well, it's fascinating. It's frightening. A lot of good information there, John. I appreciate you
Sure.
you exposing some of this stuff and for helping me out with answering some of these questions. I appreciate that.
Well, and Paul Baird's been at this a long time. His website's been up for
Right.
years. And this is a global problem. I mean, we're making a lot of noise about it and trying to get exposure in the United States, but I get emails from just about every country in the world with people complaining about this. And, and at least from a medical perspective, for a psychiatrist or for a medical doctor that maybe sees one person in their practice that's complaining of this, it's real easy to see it as mental illness. But when you dive into it a little deeper, like I have, and you're really seeing the vast numbers of people globally that are having not similar, but identical complaints, then it's clear as day that there's something more to it. So,
Yeah, there definitely appears to be. So that's great. I appreciate you you helping us with this.
all right. Thanks, Jeff.